Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi is on an African tour, hoping to forge new alliances. As Iran's economy struggles under Western sanctions, what can Africa offer? And does Tehran have any influence on the continent? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Some have called it a new beginning for relations between Iran and African nations. The Iranian president is visiting the continent to increase trade and economic ties, with stops in Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. It's a different approach for a country that for years has focused mostly within the Middle East and parts of Asia. But faced with U.S. sanctions, it appears Tehran is now increasingly looking elsewhere to diversify its economy. But are there other factors at play? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Katia Lopez-Hodayan.
A warm welcome for Iran's president in Kenya's capital. It's a rare tour for Ebrahim Raisi, marking the first visit to Africa by an Iranian president in more than a decade. U.S. sanctions have isolated Tehran for years, and trade deals in Africa could lead to new business opportunities and new alliances.
None of us are satisfied with the current volume of trade and the ongoing economic exchange between Iran and Kenya.
Iran exported more than $1 billion worth of goods to nations in Africa last year, from petrochemical products to food and medicine. Now it's aiming for more. Iran stepped up its diplomatic approach after the U.S. reimposed sanctions in 2018, when former President Donald Trump ditched a nuclear pact. Now, Iran's foreign policy appears to be shifting again. After restoring diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia in March, it seems to be expanding its economic and political reach beyond the region. Some analysts say less tension with neighbors is leading to more attention abroad. Raisi visited Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua last month to increase trade and economic ties in Latin America.
Despite imperial aggressions and sanctions imposed by the U.S., Venezuela is still standing. It's extending its hand to Iran to build a new world.
Ruto will now host.
Iran has described Africa as a continent of opportunities. Tehran is now hoping Raisi's visit will help lead to new prospects, both political and economic. Katia Lopez-Hodayan for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Nairobi, Ngala Chome, senior analyst at Sahan Research, a think tank focusing on security and development in the Horn of Africa. In Tehran, Akbar Dareini, researcher at the Center for Strategic Studies. And in Miami, Eric Loeb, associate professor at Florida International University and a member of the Board of Trustees at the American Institute of Iranian Studies. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Ali, let me start with you today. Tehran has called this three-country tour of Africa a new beginning in relations with the continent. What kind of new relationship, new beginning is President Raisi expecting, and what is he hoping to achieve with this trip?
President Raisi's visit to Africa is in line with his administration's efforts to create new alliances with the non-Western world in the current era of transition in international relations from a unipolar world to a multipolar system. It is also in line with his look to the East policy of expanding economic and political relations with the non-Western world. Iran is looking for closer relations with Africa to diversify its economy and defeat the sanctions. One way of defeating the sanctions is to increase Iran's international presence, improve cooperation with the non-Western world. This can help Iran get out of isolation and defeat the sanctions. In this context, the Raisi administration looks at Africa as a continent of opportunities that had been largely ignored by the previous Rouhani administration. The previous Rouhani administration's top priority was to get the sanctions lifted, and his team was influenced by the neoliberalism school of thought that sought to solve Iran's problems through negotiations with the West. But the JCPOA proved to be a disaster. The sanctions were not lifted, the United States. But the Raisi administration has adopted a new strategy of trying to thwart and nullify the sanctions while keeping the path of diplomacy open in case there is a way to revive the JCPOA. Two major global developments.
Ali, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do want to get back to you in a moment and ask you more about the issue of the sanctions and the JCPOA. But first, I want to go to Eric because I saw him reacting to some of what you were saying. It looks like you wanted to jump in, Eric. But I also want to ask you, Iran's president visiting the continent to boost trade ties with Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. From your vantage point, how different is this approach for a country that has for years focused mostly on opportunities within the region?
Well, we actually do see some continuity here. We should note that President Raisi is visiting Kenya among the three countries that he's visiting on his African tour. And even predating the revolution, Kenya was the second and has been the second largest trade partner for, again, pre-revolutionary Iran and the Islamic Republic after South Africa. And this relationship really is formulated in Kenyan exports primarily of tea to Iran in exchange for oil, carpets, and chemicals. And so there's a lot of continuity here in terms of the trade relationship between Iran and Kenya, as well as even with Zimbabwe and Uganda, less with trade. They are much smaller trade partners than Kenya, but Iran in the past has engaged in economic activities there. Notably, in both Zimbabwe and Uganda, it's set up automobile and tractor factories to boost its production there, as well as worked with Uganda on its fisheries and other sectors of agriculture, livestock, and industry. So there's actually a lot of continuity on the economic side to this visit.
Ngala, you heard Ali there talk about the fact that Iran's economy has for quite a while now been struggling under Western sanctions. I want to ask you, what can Africa offer Iran at this stage?
Thank you. I mean, I agree with Ali that there's some continuity, but there are also some nuances and new context to be paid attention to. One is Iran's own sense of isolation. I mean, still facing U.S. sanctions, but also seeking to repair relations with African countries such as Egypt and Morocco, and closer home in the Horn of Africa, seeking to play a larger role in a region where other sort of Gulf or Middle Eastern countries have recently come to play a large role in development projects, but also in areas such as security and defense cooperation. In the discussion the president of Iran had today with the president of Kenya, a lot of it seemed to have centered on the traditional areas of trade, investments, ICT. And less spoken about was the issue of security, which has also seen other sort of Gulf countries, Middle Eastern countries such as Qatar, the UAE, much more recently, coming to play a role in the Horn of Africa. Kenya being one of the frontline states in Somalia's war against Al-Shabaab. It would have been, very interesting if that particular issue was not discussed during today's meeting. We really suspect that this was also part of the conversation, even though it was in public.
Ali, you were speaking before about the impact that the Western sanctions were having on Iran. You were also talking about the fact that former U.S. President Donald Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And I want to zoom in a little bit more on that and ask you more specifically about the fact that Iran has really stepped up diplomatic outreach in the past several months, how much of that does it speak to how big of a problem the sanctions have been, and how much concern there was about the fact that the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal?
Sanctions has been hurting Iran for a long time, but the Raisi administration's top priority is to defeat the sanctions. And one way of that is improving relations with the non-Western world. His tour of Africa represents a major strategic shift in Iran's foreign policy. And this shift has been caused by two key global developments. One was the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA and the reimposition of sanctions. The other is a shift in world power. There has been a major shift in the global balance of power. The unipolar system has gone away, and the United States can no longer dictate its policies on the entire planet anymore. So this creates more room for developing states and more room to breathe and more options. And President Raisi's tour of Africa is a major change because Iran, at the same time, has adopted a new strategic direction to complement the African economy, to improve business for the benefit of the two sides, and at the same time show to the international community that Iran has other alternatives, even if the sanctions are not lifted.
Eric, you heard Ali there talking about the fact that what President Raisi is doing now is quite a major break with what former administrations have done when it comes to foreign policy. And I want to ask you, from your vantage point, how does what President Raisi is doing now compare or contrast to what former President Hassan Rouhani did when it came to foreign policy?
Well, I would agree that it's a major contrast. I had published an article with a colleague at the University of Tehran where we detailed President Rouhani, as was said earlier, disengagement from Africa and focus on, particularly leading up to the negotiations for the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, in 2015, really focused on the West and on trying to alleviate sanctions through that process. And so there was a disengagement, and that really also culminated with disengagement on the African side as well, where Arab Gulf states, namely Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, went on a diplomatic offensive, offered military and economic assistance, particularly to the states in the Horn of Africa, which is a very strategic location on the Red Sea during the Yemeni civil war, and convinced these countries to cut ties with Iran in 2016. So this is an important shift for the Raisi administration, for Iran, in terms of trying to build back these relationships in the Horn of Africa and the wider continent.
Ngala, let me ask you, how much influence does Tehran have on the continent at this particular moment?
One often missed area, I feel, when it comes to relationship between Tehran and African countries, also in Kenya, where I am, is usually sometimes the sort of the cultural sphere. We all know that Islam that is practiced in Africa is mostly Sunni, and in East Africa mostly Sunni of the Shafi tradition. But in much more recent years, especially since the 1980s, there has been an increase in sort of Shia Islamic schools of thought that have been sort of sponsored by charities or Muslim charities coming from Islam. There is not quite a figure I could put, but there has been a visible increase in Shia mosques and madrasas, for example, in Kenya over the years. One area where one may argue Iran has not been playing a larger role is in the creation of availability of employment opportunities, where many young Africans, Kenya, Uganda, but also further afield in Western Africa, have found opportunities of work in Gulf states, in Qatar, in the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia. But Iran seems to miss, the name of Iran seems to miss in this growing economic relationship between Africa and the Middle East. And I think maybe this could also be one area that could form part of the discussions that Raisi is going to have with a number of African presidents that he's going to meet in this recent tour.
Ali, it looked to me like you were reacting to some of what Ngala was saying there. Did you want to jump in?
I disagree with just part of what he said. Under the Raisi administration, Iran's new strategic direction is largely aimed at economic and strategic cooperation with African states. While Iran is an Islamic republic, I don't see ideology playing a much big role in this now. The priority is economic, technological, and trade cooperation with African states. Iran is exporting just $1.2 billion to Africa. This demonstrates the depth of Iran neglecting this continent of opportunities. Iran's foreign trade had been taken hostage by the JCPOA, and the previous Rouhani administration entirely neglected Africa. Now, under this new strategic direction, Iran is reviving its policy of improving and boosting relations with Africa. And the two sides have a lot to offer. Africa is a good market for Iran's knowledge-based companies, engineering services, dam building projects, transportation, fishing, and car production exports, agricultural exports. So there is a lot Iran can offer, and at the same time import part of its needs from Africa. That had been neglected, and under the Rouhani administration, under the Raisi administration, Iran is trying to rectify that and at the same time defeat the sanctions.
Eric, I can see you want to add to some of what Ali was saying there, but I just want to go back to Ngala for a minute. Ngala, Ali was responding to some of the points you made earlier, so I just wanted to see if you wanted to add to that.
Yes, I would, and I do agree with Ali. A lot of the focus has been on building diplomatic relationships, and especially around trade and also in investment. So it's very economic, this language of this kind of newly looked for partnerships. It does make sense because, Raisi was elected on a platform of fixing the economy at home. President William Ruto, where he's currently was also elected on a similar platform, but they've both faced inflation. The currency of Kenya has depleted in terms of value, similar to the Iranian currency. So it makes sense that both of them would come around these economic issues. But what I'm basically saying is that one area that's often overlooked and where Iran may actually have a longer historical influence is in this cultural sphere. I think if you look at how the Chinese, for example, have built their relationships across the continent, is that as they built their relationships through economic partnerships, they also are channeling, sort of cultural items. In this case, the learning of the Chinese language, setting up of Chinese schools has also been part of that diplomacy. And I think that for Iran to have a much more influential impact on the continent, is that they could continue also emphasizing this more kind of softer cultural relationships as well.
Eric, you've been waiting patiently to add your comments to what's being said right now. So please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree that economics and trade and commerce are certainly at the forefront of this initiative. And given that Africa really only represents 2 to 3% of Iran's global trade, there's a lot of potential in that relationship. On the flip side, there's also the geopolitical component of this, where these countries can be non-permanent members on the UN Security Council, and of course they sit in the UN General Assembly, on the IAEA Board of Governors, and they can potentially influence votes for Iran. Not to mention the fact that both Zimbabwe and Uganda have uranium deposits, and so there's some value there in terms of nuclear enrichment. In terms of the cultural ideological realm, I would say that Iran is going to be pushing on two levers. Given that, again, this is a Christian and Sunni majority continent, it will be really pushing on the anti-colonialism card, which it often does when it visits these countries, to try to galvanize elites and citizens during these visits. And then secondly, it will also seek to make inroads in the small Shia communities of these countries, particularly in Kenya and Uganda.
Eric, I also want to ask you about particularly one of the countries that's come up a few times already in this discussion, and that's Saudi Arabia and the role that the reestablishment of diplomatic ties that Iran has now had with Saudi Arabia is playing in all of this. The fact that the diplomatic ties between both countries were restored in March, is that one of the reasons why we're now seeing Iran seeming to expand its economic and political reach beyond just the immediate region?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking about that very point. Not only is there rapprochement or détente, let's say, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but there's also a ceasefire in the works in Yemen, which was one of the reasons why the continent became so geopolitically or strategically important and tense between the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So given these developments, it may actually give African countries geopolitical capital now to re-engage Iran and to feel that they don't necessarily have to choose sides between Iran and Arab Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Ali, let me ask you a version of the same question. The fact that diplomatic ties have been reestablished between Iran and Saudi Arabia, how much is that playing into what's going now? How much has that allowed Iran to be able to go beyond its traditional foreign policy goals?
A lot. The Raisi administration's policy of look to the East is primarily designed to boost Iran's overall deterrence capability against the West. And Africa is playing an important role. To achieve that, Iran needs to expand its international presence, de-escalate tensions with regional states, and pave the way for better relations with the non-Western world, and that is happening right now. The mediation by China, Iran's improving relations with BRICS, and Iran's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Council all speak of Iran's new strategic direction. And the Raisi administration has been pursuing the resistance discourse in its foreign policy. That means trying to defend Iran's national interests and giving concessions in return for concessions, and not providing concessions without obtaining concessions. At the same time, the Raisi administration has been saying all along that the world is not limited to the West. This is a reference to the previous Rouhani administration's policy, that its foreign policy was largely confined to negotiations with the West. And the Raisi administration wants to create a balance in Iran's relations with the outside world. And one way of doing that is to improve relations with Asian, Euro-Asian, Latin American, and African states. And this is what we are witnessing right now.
Ngala, I want to ask you more specifically about Kenya. When it comes to Kenya's foreign policy, how is this visit being perceived by members of the government, by members of the opposition, and by the citizens?
Well, so Kenya's foreign policy has historically had a very strong economic impulse. From the time of the non-aligned movement to the post-1990 world as well. So therefore, a lot of what has happened today was widely expected, that a lot of the discussions would center around opportunities for trade and investment. The Kenyan president has announced that there will be a model of a car that will actually be manufactured in Kenya from Iran. locally referred to as Kifaru. And so a lot of the discussions were, centered around economic, trade relations, investments, and information technology as well. But like I had said earlier, is that Kenya is also one of the frontline states on the ongoing war against Somalia's Al-Shabaab. And in that front, other Middle Eastern countries have also come to play a huge role in addition to the traditional Western countries playing a role in the region as well in that sphere. And in this case, I'm referring to the United Arab Emirates and Turkey. And therefore, for me, in my view, I think that Iran may be thinking as well to also play a role in this sort of security defense partnerships as well.
Ngala,
such as Kenya.
Ngala, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are starting to run out of time, and I just want to ask one final question to Eric. Eric, I saw you shaking your head there, actually nodding your head to some of what Ngala was saying, and I just want to ask you very quickly, we have about a minute and a half left. This attempt by President Raisi to reset relations with African officials, does it look to you like it will be successful?
Well, I think it could be successful. And like I said earlier, I think one of the pathways could be this dialing down of Gulf tensions within the continent and giving some breathing room to these countries to re-engage Iran. And so I think there's some flexibility and some potential to work with. At the same time, I wouldn't necessarily be overly optimistic in terms of what Africa could do for Iran and vice versa, given the limitations that both sides have. And I think for that reason, despite Raisi's stated eastward policy, we're seeing the Iranians, in a more subtle level, re-engaging the United States and working out an informal agreement to try to bring sanctions relief in exchange for prisoner releases and nuclear limitations.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Ngala Chome, Ali Akbar, Dareini, and Eric Loeb. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.